All right, I think we're about there. Anybody that else joins might just miss out on the poll. Very excited to have everybody here. Thank you. I see some familiar faces that have been here before and some other familiar faces. As we get started, I just want to do some housekeeping items. Encourage you to ask your questions throughout. Feel free to do what you want, whether you want to wait till the end or not. But if there's something that comes up during our discussion, throw it in the chat and we'll, in between breaks, based on our discussion, we'll go ahead and ask them. If you want to ask the question live, feel free to use the hand raise feature or just mention in the chat and we'll let you come on, whether you want to bring your video on, say hello. That is totally an open opportunity. We really want, this is for you guys. So we're really excited to give information, allow you to talk with Darwin and I. So with that said, let me kick us off. Welcome back to, this is our 4th episode of When Things Go Wrong, presented by the GNP Collective. I'm really excited to have Isolocity as our sponsors. We'll speak more about them later. And we have a really exciting episode today. Today's topic is on industry standards and how they can help your business mitigate risk, claim validation, and quality assurance. And I realize that standards it just doesn't have the most sexiest name, but I think folks will find, especially with Darwin here, which you'll meet in a moment, that it's a really important and fun, exciting topic. So that's our goal here. And some of the key takeaways is, to learn what standards are, how to use them, understand how they mitigate your risk, and really improve your brand by implementing industry standards. And then discover, we'll talk a bit about what standards can be used to create market protections rather than barriers to entry, because that's the last thing we need in our industry. We've got enough hoops to follow with the current compliance or lack thereof harmonization of compliance and regulations. So we're going to dive into some really cool things. With that said, I want to start a poll just to get a pulse on who's here so we know that we're speaking to the right audience. So take about 30 seconds here, maybe give you about a minute. 3 quick questions. What part of the industry do you represent? What stage of operation are you in? And do you know what a standard is? Looks like we're getting some good responses. All right, down to 15 seconds. Get your answers in. I know they're really tough questions. Don't overthink them. 5 seconds. Going once, going twice, and sold. All right, so just to kind of look at the results of what we've got here as a spread, we've got a good amount of ancillary providers. We've got a few processors and a cultivator. No distributors here today. Reminder, if you're watching this after the fact, since this is recorded and does go on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it later or share with your friends and colleagues, let them know what great things they missed out on. Most folks have been in this for a few years. Some folks are pre-revenue, and I like it. Maybe that's all the above. You're ready for the next 10 years and you've been in it for a few years. I think that's totally possible as well. So really like these answers, and most folks seem to know what a standard is, or at least think they know. So with that said, let me bring Mr. Darwin Millard on stage. Love to introduce you, sir. You are an amazing colleague, a force. I'll never forget meeting you and seeing you up on stage speaking at ASTM's first meeting that we were at in Toronto in June of 2017. Thanks for joining here today, sir. Tell me a bit about yourselves for the audience.
Oh, hey, David. First off, thanks so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. I remember that meeting too. Those first in Toronto, I stood up and said we should remove hemp from our lexicon right off the bat, right? So you knew who Darwin was. Yeah, so I am, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here on When Things Go Wrong. I am a mechanical engineer by training, with 18 years now in cannabis. Right out of college, this is what I did. I've had no other legal career. I could have designed slurry pumps for the fracking industry,
It
or I
kind
could
of
have
is
done
like
something
Dr.
else.
Spock too, if you look.
So what I did was I jumped into Colorado's fledgling medical cannabis industry, and I wouldn't change things for the world. It's given me an opportunity to meet amazing people like yourself, and travel the world and pursue a passion of mine. So yeah, like I guess I really haven't had really worked a day in my life.
And that is the dream, right? And you are currently the Chief Science Officer for Final Bell Corporation, and you also serve, if I'm correct, the Subcommittee Vice Chair for two subcommittees at ASTM, the Cannabis Processing and Handling Committee, and then the Co-Chair for the Industrial Hemp Subcommittee, correct?
That is correct. How could I have forgotten to talk about ASTM International and the D37 committee?
Well, because we've got the next 45 minutes to nerd out on that, right?
Of course.
So with that said, let me stop screen sharing so you can see our awesome faces in full screen, and let's dive in. So, I mean, Darwin, I don't even know where to begin, but let me actually get my notes so I do know where to begin. I mean, where do you want to begin? Like, why are people not using the standards that exist? Or what is the importance of standards? Just kind of start there.
Ooh, well, those are two really good questions. I mean, standards are really important because they can provide you with risk mitigation tools, which I think we'll get into more down the road. And why they're not really being taken advantage of, I think, is the real critical question, right? Because when you start talking about standards, people are like, oh, yeah, I understand what that is. I get that there are GMPs, right? There are good manufacturing practices, or there are GLPs, right? They're good laboratory practices. They're good documentation practices, and all sorts of things, right? That you could theoretically consider a standard. But why aren't we implementing them here in the cannabis industry? And, maybe it's because really standards, when you start thinking about that, you're thinking about, okay, my industry is maturing, right? And I want to be here for a long time. So now I'm thinking long-term business strategy. And perhaps we're like in that switch, we're in that paradigm period where people are moving away from that, I'm going to get quick uh, get a rich quick scheme, right? And into maybe the more of, okay, I'm going to be around for a while. Let's, see what risk mitigation strategies we can put into place where we can make sure our brand, right, is well established and is going to be here for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well said. And I think maybe to build off of that, ASTM International, for example, where you and I are the most active. First, establishing that, ASTM being 120 years old, there's something like 13,000 standards across 140 technical industries. I think folks can get stuck in, well, standardization can mean some negative things, right? From you're telling me that I must just do things systematically. Any folks that are here that are familiar with California, there's probably a good example of the right now with the requirement to have a standardized single test method for cannabinoid testing. That is probably, I know the labs are not very happy with that for valid reasons. I'm glad that there's been some changes based on the scope of that standard, but that really gives standards a bad rap, and it imagines, stifling innovation. But when you think about the fact that we've got 38, 39 marketplaces across the US, there is no standardization. If you want to have a brand that tastes, feels, looks the same in Colorado as in California, as in Massachusetts, that means you have to have some level of standardization, right? And so, I mean, I'll kind of let you go in one of two directions or both, maybe giving a case study of talking a bit about ASTM getting started in 1898 and how that really solved problems that today we take for granted and how standards are everywhere. I want to start there.
Well, before I forget it, I want to ping off of what you're talking about in California and this transition to, a singular method, a standard test method for determining cannabinoid content. Labs who may have a business interest in developing a proprietary method might be upset by that. But me as a producer, a manufacturer of product, that's awesome. Now I don't have to actually, it's not method discrepancy between lab to lab. I can start to narrow down the variables that are affecting my data. It's got to be sample prep or age of the standard or more common things related to, again, good laboratory practices, right? That we can have a root cause analysis to figure out really what's happening, right? But without that first step of the state saying, hey, you got to use method A, there's no way of really trusting the data, right? So I think it's an amazingly great benefit for the marketplace. And that's a huge plus for the market and how a standard is going to help things. In regards to how ASTM started back when it was the American Society for Testing and Materials, and before an acronym that didn't mean anything with the word international slapped on the end of it, right? The very first standards created were for the railroad ties, right? You had to make sure that trains could get to point A to point B. And if you had different manufacturers making different gauge rails, guess what happens to the trains? Plop plop. And if you've got a lot of commerce, which in that time, the 1800s, depends on the railroads, and your trains are falling apart because, I don't have the exact names of the different competing railroads at the time, right, are making different gauges, that's not going to be conducive for business practices. So that's, again, how, standards came to be, really, and effectively allowed industrialization really to take place here in the United States.
And Darwin, I think you hit on, there's two words. First word, trust. Trust is so important and key to you and I's relationship. If we didn't trust each other, we probably wouldn't be here talking, right? Think about putting that into a marketplace where there are real economic dollars at stake. How do we ensure trust? Whether it's you as the producer working with a lab, how do you trust the lab result? That's an issue. Everybody talks about that, lab shopping, blah, blah, blah. But then even within a more mature supply chain, let's put Florida aside as perhaps the poster child example of vertical integration market. There is there are folks that the only way to control the supply chain is to own the supply chain. Well, there's pros and cons to that, as we all know. And so let's go back to, how do you ensure, even if you own the supply chain, which again in the Florida market really just means the cannabis plant. What about everything else? What about your nutrients? What about your testing lab still? What about your personnel? How do you qualify your personnel? Is there a standardized way to establish there's the credentials so that it's not just, well, Darwin thought this and hoped that this credentialing process will be sufficient, versus there's thousands of experts that came together from cross disciplines and expertise and work together to say, this is the consensus minimum requirement of what creates a good, credentialed employee, or a, cleaning and sanitation practice. So I guess I forgot the second word, which I believe was related to commerce, which is back to the economic dollars. So there's a lack of implementation across the marketplace today of standardization standards, but I think you and I both agree, kind of to your point, that we are still just in an early marketplace and we're still growing and we're developing those standards, and as they start to get more utilized, I mean, the time is now to be at the table, right? You and I have been at the table for 5 years. As soon as they start being incorporated by reference into law, as soon as folks start using them more and more in supply chain contracts, there's going to be an amazing outcry of, what's it? Wait, I have to adhere to what? Who came up with this?
Yep.
You could be doing that now. So go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that's great. And that's when we're really going to start to see adoption of standards. And I think the industry is still in a place where, right, if it costs them money to do something, they're really not going to implement it. But if it costs someone else money not to do something, then they'll definitely do it because it provides you with that strategic advantage. And I think we have a couple of great standards that the D37 has created that we can leverage off of that, being our water activity standard. And I think the 3 that just recently were published out of the O4, shout out to the subcommittee that I vice chair, along with Peter McGuire and Bob Chapman, 2 amazing individuals there who help lead that subcommittee. But we now have a water activity standard that came out of O4 that defines the effectively the relative humidity that a flower sample should be established at to maintain not only its maximum aesthetic quality, which is, of course, that's what makes it sell, right? Is how good does it look, but prevents microbial content, and it provides microbial contamination from being able to um, take hold, right? And so effectively it gives you a quality metric and two different quality metrics, right? Aesthetics as well as preventing contamination. But what it also does is provides a harmonization point for sampling, for actually taking the test of the cannabinoid content. And this is being worked through several different standards and concepts nationally within the National Conference for Weights and Measures, where they are currently, they control 46 different states in the United States, and they're looking to define how flour would be weighed to determine, to validate the net weight declaration. The same concept can be used to validate the cannabinoid content, and that's being worked through our label specification. Oh, cross the fingers, will hopefully make its way through the balloting process currently. But we have two or three other great amazing support standards in regards to the environmental conditions during the actual packaging operation for the flour, and then the environmental conditions in which you would store that packaged flour and then transport that packaged flour. And all of those support the water activity. Leveraging those within contracts now means that I'm buying bulk flour. I'm going to do it as for a contract service so that I can package other flour for brands. I now have defined specifications I'm going to put in a contract that says I need this bulk flour to hit this water activity, and you've got to do these three maintain these environmental conditions within the mean kinetic temperature that I define based on these ASTM standards. So these four standards are incredibly powerful right now, and just knowing about them and their significance and how they are used to support commerce is going to be critical. So effectively right now, I have protections as a buyer that if my material comes in at the wrong water activity, or I have use a mean kinetic temperature meter on the containers, right, that it's going to be shipped in and things like that, and I find that it went out of the range that I said I wanted, then I'm rejecting this sample, and you're hurting for money because I'm not paying you, and you have to take a whole bunch of flour that at least I'm not willing to buy back. And or I'm going to take it because, hey, that's how the marketplace is right now, but you're going to get pinched really hard because it didn't meet my specs, and now I've got to make XYZ excuses and or compromises along the production train, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I've been talking a lot, David.
Darwin, I love it. I mean, there is so much to unpack there. So let me kind of just try to translate it for a second to folks, and give some applications, which you just did. So let me add to that and say, think about one case. You're a new producer, you're starting, or you're producer of flour, and you have a distributor, whether it's your own or it's a third-party distributor, to transport it to the dispensary, the retail outlet, or even the distribution center. Have you thought about the environmental conditions for the transport of it? Yeah, all right, that makes sense, right? Let's think about my milk, or I had a friend lived in Flagstaff, Arizona, who was bringing a top-tier chocolate company, top chocolate, to Flagstaff. Well, guess what she realized? Can't get that stuff shipped in the summer because it sits on the tarmac in Phoenix, Arizona, and it completely melts for 6 months of the year. So we've got to deal with cold storage and supply chain issues. And well, where do you even establish who came up with, where do I start as a new business? What temperatures are acceptable? What humidity is acceptable? Light, no light? Oh wait, there's a standard that actually tells me that? It solves problems. You don't have to figure out where to start from scratch. There is industry experts that have really sat there and talked about things like mean kinetic temperature, which unless you have a background in physics, you might be like, what's this MKT? I mean, let's not even get into Kelvin and whatnot, but this is really important technical stuff that is figured out and put into a standard that you can use. And then that drives the marketplace commerce. And I guess the other example is, we take for granted every day, whether it's gasoline at the pump. You see, I forget what the exact wording is, but some folks know, a lot of folks don't, that as minor as it is, there is a quantifiable difference in terms of the volume based on the expansion, the thermodynamic properties. If it's the middle of the afternoon and that's a warm tank versus a cold tank in the middle of winter, the amount of gasoline you're getting in terms of volume versus actual weight. So there's somebody that is evaluated that and has a standard specification so that every gas pump at least reads a precise repeatable value. That's really important stuff for marketplace, because you want to ensure that you're actually getting what you paid for, right? And that goes back to the cannabis industry and water activity, right? This is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it's kind of like, why does these environmental condition standards matter, right? Why does mean kinetic temperature matter? Well, it was all based on and designed to maintain the cannabinoid content of the flower, right? Because that's what's the selling point, not only the weight of the flower, but its potency. So that's what these mean kinetic temperatures were developed around. And I think one of the points that you hit there, right, is the fact that this for cannabis, because it's new, we're coming out of prohibition. This really hasn't happened for a long time in the United States, or really anywhere for a lot of different products, right? So we're kind of coming at this again from scratch, but also thinking again that, oh, well, it's established, we know how to do this. So the safe product safety considerations or assumptions that I take for granted along when I walk into your gas station example, right? And I'm just going to go through, I'm paying for gas, but oh, candy bar, right? And I'm going to do my spontaneous spot buy, and I don't even question anything about it, because there are decades of established good manufacturing practices in place, standards, and actual regulations, laws, right, that cite some of these standards that then make it so that you have to, me as the consumer, don't even stop to think about, oh, the candy bar I'm buying, do I need to scan the QR code on the back to see when it was tested, to look up the contaminants and know that it passed? And then, oh, here's the cannabinoid content. I'm confused. What does sum versus total of cannabinoids mean? That just doesn't, like, as a consumer, it doesn't, you're just not going to do that. You just assume this, I was told this is good and I'm going to buy it.
Yep.
Especially some of the CBD products, right, that we are starting to see that are hemp, and that we can start to see just out on the open marketplace. That naive consumer just picks that up thinking that it's sold exactly like the other types of candy bars without any type of safety consideration. And so that's when people are thinking like, oh, well, standards now, that's burdensome, having to put in place, the protocols, et cetera, dot my I's, cross my T's, make sure inventory is correct, right? Do all of those things. That's where I think people get hung up on the minutia, right? And then that's where we have the hesitancy to really start to adopt and appreciate the power of these standards.
Yes, and I'm just looking to try to find it. I think there is what is it, like the last, okay, here we go. I actually found it very quickly. Maybe the upteenth study that's been done in the last year or two alone. But to your point, I'm just reading from Marijuana Moments news cap this morning digest. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, also a government agency under Department of Commerce, which is very active at ASTM. Our vice chair for the lab subcommittee is a NIST employee. They conducted a study of hemp products and found that of the 53 samples examined, 49 were incorrectly labeled as hemp because they technically fit the federal classification of marijuana. And when you go back to the question of according to who, lab shopping, et cetera, well, NIST is the ones that ensure that a kilogram is a kilogram, that noon o'clock is noon o'clock, and within a very precise, down to the millisecond, right, nanosecond. So that's the type of integrity we need in our industry. And let's tie that into claim validation, right? Let's think about where you were going. Is it 17.423% THC, and then a consumer brings a lawsuit against you because they found that the label does not actually meet the test? What basis do you have to defend yourself as a producer? How can standards help you with that?
Oh, well, that's a great question, right? And that also comes down to, again, how can standards help the regulators? So not only is there a question of what's the right range, and is my product out of spec or in spec, right? So there's kind of the two ways to approach it, is that you don't want a super wide range that just allows anybody to meet specification, but you don't want something so tight that manufacturers can't even make products, right?
Mhm.
So regulators are like, well, what's the right range? What is the range that one should choose that is actually conducive for marketplace, for the businesses to actually run, but is going to protect the industry? So we did a lot of research and defined a limit of plus or minus 15% for or plus or minus 3 times the lower limit of quantitation. And so that can be dependent on what the authority having jurisdiction defines to use as their analytical instruments, lower limit of quantitation for the form that's being tested, right? So all of those things need to be known to determine whether or not which one of those is least restrictive. So plus or minus 15% or plus or minus 3 times the lower limit of quantitation. And that's currently within the label specification. And so what that would provide is clarity for the marketplace. So yes, these are volunteer standards, but as awareness becomes around and regulators start to see like, oh, there's an answer to this question, I don't have to think about it. It went through a consensus process, thousands of members from around the world, all technical experts and some not, et cetera. Lots of different backgrounds reviewed this and said, yeah, that makes sense to be the range. And this, or whichever is least restrictive, makes sense concept-wise, then boom, now you've got a marketplace that adopts it, or that especially important for marketplaces that haven't yet legalized. They can answer these questions and put into place things much more quickly because they've seen it work, and or they know the reputation of the organization and the process that developed them. So again, what it answers the question of, well, how do I know if the product is within specification? It said it was supposed to be X, but it's X plus, a little bit. Well, this now answers that question again and gives you a defined means of whether or not it's a low dose or a high dose. You could be confident that your product is going to meet specifications, and most importantly, that label claim, right? So if you're claiming that it's X potent or whatever, and that drives its value, which right now that's what the commodity value for the product is, then the consumer can rest assured that they're actually getting what they're paying for. And regulators, inspectors can rest assured that there are no unreasonable shortages, and effectively, right, that you're not frauding the purchaser by selling them less than what they paid for.
Yep, it's so important. I mean, that 15% number, I like to tell my clients from the get-go, like, ranges are your friend. A number has a margin of error. When the lab results, I'll never forget a client where sitting down and I was so impressed with them. They ran quintuplicate analyses of their distillate, and I was like, that's so amazing. You didn't just take one sample out of whatever kilo vat size you were working with, and you sent it out 5 different samples. And it was like, he's like, yeah, but the numbers were garbage. I was like, tell me more. 67, 67.5, 67.2, 68%, and like 66.7%. And I was like, holy crap, that, like, the RPD of that is like less than 2%. That's amazing data, and that's really great. But the fear of a lot of folks without that kind of guidance is when the regulator shows up and you say it's 67%, but they say it tested out 65. Is that okay? Where does that number stop? And without a standard, it's my word versus yours, and that's just 2 opinions, right? Until it goes through this vetted process, and it just it solves so many problems, right?
Absolutely.
I want to pause for a second. There's some great stuff going on in the chat, and I want to make sure there's no questions that I'm missing. Amy, I saw you made a reference to the NIST handbook and how it's uniform fuels and automotive lubricants, that might be an odd place to put the commodity. I don't know if that got addressed, or if between Chuck's mention, or if Darwin, you want to address that?
Sure. Well, I mean, HB Handbook 130 are the labeling and packaging standards, which are codified into regulations for consumer and non-consumer goods. It also defines how fuel and gas products are to be labeled, but it goes into significantly, it goes into all product forms of all different categories. So the title, it's like, it's metrology, right? So that's really where you get into all the various different consumer products. So, and it's part 4 that you specifically would be looking at, which is the packaging and labeling regulations. And I think it's section A, which is for consumer products.
Yep, Uniform Packaging and Labeling Regulations, PAL, under section 4. So yeah, I think the fuels can easily throw folks off with like, oh, it's fuel, like what does that do? But it all comes back to metrology, right? The study of measurements, right? And that's it. Everything kind of falls under from there, and that includes consumer packaged goods.
And then HB 133, right, is then how you would actually measure stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really important. And Adrian, yeah, thank you for the kudos. I think I know you on the cultivation and that side of the world. The VPD, the water activity ranges are super critical. To your point, Darwin, it's quality and safety, right? That's what we were talking about earlier. The safety profile of mitigating microbial growth, and then the quality, the aesthetics, the terpenoids, the volatility of these active ingredients and components that consumers. That's why we grew the plant. That's why we harvested. That's why we purchased it. You want to make sure that it has a level of consistency, and that's key. You need, it requires a lot of considerations to go into this to make a product safe and consistent.
Well, it also is what establishes your brand in the marketplace long-term, right? Again, going back to long-term business strategy. If you want to be around in the next 3-5 years, 12 months, right? You want to be able to make sure that people trust your label claims, whatever you're saying on the label, whether it be the net weight, which is, that's going to be important because, again, in 46 states, you have a federal agency that is going to be checking in and making sure that these products actually hit weight. Aside, making sure that they're actually, the potency is the right potency.
Mm-hmm. I'm loving these chat comments. Yeah, I think true story. I've been facing a lot of resistance with standards. Statement I get is drug cartels never use standards. I bet that person was actually ill-informed. I bet they did. I bet the scales they had were calibrated, and that when they were shorted, they went right back to somebody, and it was maybe a little less formal with different oversight. But there was standards there. They just didn't realize there were standards there, right? Those orders were standards. So it kind of comes back full circle, right? And then the point of, how much does it cost for recall these days? I've worked on a couple of insurance cases where, because of the lab results, well, guess what? Your product gets destroyed. You get $500,000 of product that's stuck in quarantine. And what can you do about it? Well, you have no legal defensibility because you had no controls in place. You have no evidence of following standards. You're stuck with the reality,
or you got to relabel, which, obviously worst case sucks. You have to destroy everything because you can't take it back, and the marketplace doesn't allow you to relabel. But in places where you do, that costs you money, costs you time, it costs you resources, costs you consumables. So, I mean, it's not a fun process to have to repeat something. Rework is never cost effective.
Yep. And with that, I want to pivot to kind of the quality aspect of standards, which you kind of naturally set us up for. But think about the cost of a recall, the cost of even the cost of rework. That is something that I found very few folks in the cannabis industry, even pretty large and call it mature players, have that level of data. So they have no idea. Oh, well, Darwin just told his, report to go, relabel 300 packages, whatever, no big deal. At the end of the day, the P&L still looks the same. They got the product out the door, but does it really? How much time did you spend, Darwin? What about the test results? If you're working in a lean operation and you were expecting to get those packages out the door today, but now it goes back a week, how is that impacting your brand and your your relationship with the distributor or the retail store that was counting on those products, plus all the cost of time. So how much did that simple rework process actually cost you?
Huge. It could cost us a client.
Yep. And I've seen that. Yeah, I've seen that with some big contracts with, very large dispensaries that are like, yeah, I can't count on you. And you have no data, and it's, what do you mean you can't count on me? And the CEO, if CEO gets involved, or even head of sales and relationships, they have no idea because they have no data to back any of this up because it's not being tracked, right?
Yeah. And, I think, again, going back to sometimes there's hesitancy to implement some of these things because you might see it as costing money, right? And return on investment is sometimes hard to see when it's long term.
Mhm.
So some of those short term, returns on investment you can start putting into place is validating some of your processes, right? Putting in simple experiments that can allow you to really show clients or yourselves, especially some of the higher ups in your business, perhaps, right, that there's a cause and an effect. And so if we do something, I can save us X amount of money, or you can fix a problem before there actually is one. And setting up simple experiments and using guides, again going back to standards, that can help industry do that is really critical. Right now, again, under O4, we have a process validation standard that is currently in the ballot process. So with groups that are coming at this totally from scratch and really have no idea how to set up an experiment, right, and just run a simple process validation, see if A really does lead to B, this is a means for doing that, and can really serves as that tool that can start putting in really some cost savings in place, right? You want to implement new process, but you're not sure if it's going to do what you think it's going to do. Well, how do you determine that? Well, this is a method that you can put into place that will standardize how you set things up.
I think that's actually, I'm going to go back to Blair's point earlier. And thank you, Blair. I haven't seen you in way too long. So it's good to see you joining us, sir. Sounds like the industry could be raising the bar when implementing these standards. So I think that really speaks to your point, Darwin, and how we can work in the marketplace. Do we, a lot of folks spend time, fighting regulations, fighting regulators, whereas flying by the seat of their pants versus putting in, using these programs and establishing them, setting the bar, telling the industry, this is what I want. I want a CAPA plan. I want to have a recall process. Everybody, I don't think anybody disagrees that you need to have a recall plan. Maybe there are, but how do you do that? What's involved in it? I don't know. That can be a lot to figure out from scratch. And, you can read guidance from pharma, from food, et cetera. But why don't I just go where several hundred folks have worked through the negatives and hashed out and said, this is a best practice for how to conduct and implement a recall plan. Great, makes your life easier. And then don't you want the regulators to adopt that? Because the regulators want to see that. So if you say, look, I'm using this consensus standard, ergo, tell me why whatever you think is any better or different, you have so much credibility and basis. So come develop those standards that you want to see, that you want your industry, your supply chain, your regulators to uphold everybody to, and make it happen. Or watch for whatever happens in 5 years from now as we watch the scheduling process start happening at the federal level and here in the US, and all of a sudden FDA or HHS says, you shall do this. It's too late at that point, right? It's literally too late to change things. It's back to the rework. It can be way more expensive to try to fight that battle than to create that industry standard and set of standards for them to just adopt.
Yeah, definitely. And that again comes back to that return on investment, right? You got to take small bites sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's where I think it's fun, where working in the international marketplace that we have here with cannabis, is that as these new burgeoning marketplaces come online, they don't have to do anything from scratch. They can look to see these established standards that are in place and can actually adopt things much more quickly than, say, our entrenched legacy markets that we have here in the United States, right? Our pseudo national, state level legal, but not nationally legal marketplaces, whereas these new countries that are coming online, right, are doing it on the national level. And that's where, again, these standards can really become super powerful and can establish international commerce and trade perhaps more quickly than, we could see them here in the United States. And maybe that may even influence and drive further standard adoption in the United States as marketplaces internationally adopt standards, forcing sellers, right, from the US who want to access those marketplaces to have to meet standards in order to do so.
Darwin, that reminds me of something I think is very poignant to say at this stage. You just brought up a really good point about the international marketplace, and I want to take your example and actually put it in the other context of I'm a producer in Nevada, California, etc. And international marketplace opens up because that's actually happening outside of the US every day. We're just insular at this point, especially in the high THC marketplace. But meanwhile, the new emerging markets are developing their marketplaces based on industry standards, and they're starting to trade with commodities so that when we open up the doors, and that happens eventually, it's not an if but a when, we live in a global society, the 10 cents a gram, or the pennies on the dollar relative to our cost of production that can actually meet those standards will be able to enter the US marketplace and completely disrupt and upend our businesses, because they will be cheaper and they will have the documentation to show that they meet the established standards, versus us here with a higher cost of operation, and we still don't have the data to show that we can meet those standards. That's a major risk. If I were a producer or anybody getting into business in the cannabis industry this day, for that reason alone, I would be at the table right now making sure that I know and that I can meet those standards.
Wait, you're saying there's an opportunity to actually develop these things we've been talking about, these standards, this nebulous concept? You can actually have a seat at the table and create, that specification for the flower, perhaps, that you said these lower cost producers could meet?
Well, and I think you bring up something, and I want to give credit to, there are multiple standards development organizations out there, and there is a actual defined criteria for an SDO. So not just anybody. Darwin and I would not be well suited. I don't think it's impossible, but almost impossible to actually develop an SDO. What Darwin and I would put together would not meet that requirement. There are plenty of groups that have tried to do that, but ASTM is 125 years old. ISO has been around since the 1940s. AOAC has been around since the 1880s or so. US Pharmacopoeia, 1820. There's ASHRAE, there's IEC, there's the Underwriters Laboratories. Those are standards development organizations because they have a process and they meet 4 principles, which I won't nerd out on. But to bring it back to your point, Darwin, what's unique about the ASTM process is that it's literally the only standards development organization where anybody in this room can not only just show up and have a seat at the table and know what's going on, but you can actually reach out to Darwin as the vice chair and literally say, Darwin, there needs to be a standard classification for, grading of different cannabis inflorescence. And you say, great, what's the scope? What's the significance in use? Go to it. Write that standard. There is nothing in the way. There's no politics of Darwin and a whole committee having to work on it with you. You literally, Amy, Chuck, any one of us, we just write that standard, you put it through the ballot process, and you get the feedback. No other place can you actually have that level of impact.
Yeah.
Am I right? What am I missing?
It's a lot of hard work.
It is a lot, but
it's all volunteer, right? And you really get out of it what you put in. So, if you're an active member and you're putting in blood, sweat, and tears, then what you're going to get out is market changing and influencing trends for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it is not it's not a very simple, easy. It's time intensive for sure, but it's also just as time intensive, if not more, when you think about yourself as a business. It's way more expensive to be, getting surprised by these standards, having to do rework, having to, struggle to meet regulations that you were blindsided by, versus you were at the table, you were leading, you were crafting them, you were influencing them. And I guess I want to just kind of start to wrap things up and segue for a minute here, but I think the related thing is just giving a brief plug. I'll put the newsroom article there. On December 6th and 7th, ASTM International and the US Pharmacopoeia. This is for folks that want to understand where the regulatory framework is in the world, right, and where we're going. So this is a free, open to everybody workshop that is happening December 6th and 7th. The executive director of the Cannabis Regulators Association, the US, will be there. Leadership from Germany's medical cannabis unit will be there. You know, they're looking at adult use regulations as well. The European monograph developers of the cannabis standard for all of Europe will be there. That's some great information that I don't know when you and I, Darwin, or anybody else here would have access to that level of information in any other industry. And that you literally will have access to that type of information with a panel, with discussions, with Q&A. And I encourage everybody to register for that and share that. Yeah. Any final thoughts, Darwin, on kind of standards as we pivot to kind of the quality side? Next steps would be a thank you to our sponsor. I want Isolocity because it's a natural segue into quality and data to talk. And then I want to make sure there's a few minutes for folks to be able to ask questions that they didn't ask in the chat. So any final thoughts, Darwin, as we segue?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess just that standards can be a lot of things, right? And there are definitely differences between them and laws, and probably way too much information to get into for final thoughts. But I think the opportunity, as you've already very nicely mentioned, to join the process, learn what a standard is, and help create those for the industry and really be a part of the change you wish to see in the world, to borrow a phrase from Gandhi. Participating in ASTM International's D37 committee, I think, is an amazing opportunity to not only shape our industry, but meet some amazing people like yourself and others who are on this call, and form probably lifelong business relationships, but also friendships with colleagues that are some of the most passionate I've seen in industry, who care about cannabis and consume it and want nothing but to see a functional real world marketplace for this. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well said, Darwin. With that, I'd like to, take a few minutes. Folks, definitely, we've got some more good information to chat about here. We've got at least 10 solid minutes. I think, Ed, your point is well received and accurate. Standards will be adopted when business customers start choosing their upstream suppliers based on those who follow and meet standards. And that just reinforces everything you and I just talked about with, industry trust and whatnot. So with that, if Chris is around, I would love to get Chris on and to join us for a couple minutes and just introduce himself. I think there's a natural segue here with quality and data. So who the heck are you? What's this Isolocity thing? And give you a few minutes.
Thanks, David. And hello, everyone. Great chat. Excellent discourse. And I definitely had a couple of takeaways from that today. My name is Chris Budd. I'm one of the co-founders of Isolocity. Isolocity is designed to really harness those types of standards we've been talking about when it comes to GMP, ISO compliance, all of those standardized processes that we want to achieve and adhere to improve our quality in our production facilities, in our cultivation facilities. And what we do is we really focus on eliminating a lot of the labor to drive automation through that record keeping process. The goal is to provide valuable insights with data analytics that provides business owners and quality managers the necessary information to make informed decisions. So that's what we're all about. We grew up in the cannabis space. We work with lots of different types of companies in the cannabis space. We work in 16 different countries. We have clients who are GMP certified, ISO certified. They've gone through lab certification 17025, if you may, and also gone through EU GMP regulatory audits as well with Yurdilex. The system, we deliver our system, all of our customer success staff are focused on cannabis regulations, so they have very good knowledge on what is required, and we deliver the service and the software with that expertise in mind. So that's a little bit about us, David. That's
awesome. Yeah, and I think the importance of, again, I'm such a fan of data, and getting to work with you guys with a couple of clients I've seen makes my life a lot easier when I have to have conversations with the senior leadership and say, how are things going? Well, I think it's going great. Well, I don't think it's going so well. Well, why? According to what? And you've got the data to do that versus, I don't know, all the papers on my desk. How do I fumble through and remember what happened back in March of, X date went versus I can search that, I can trend it, right? I think that stuff is so important for any business, right?
Absolutely. And also what's also from a compliance perspective, not only do our end users get audited to ensure that they're following their requirements and protocols, but Isolocity itself, we also get audited, right? So our system's audited against a pharmaceutical grade when it comes to GMP compliance. And so we also rely on people who are smarter than us with this stuff to ensure that we're keeping ourselves in compliance. So we're able to ensure our clients are in compliance as well too. And bringing it back to data analysis, David, it's as good as the data in it's got to be good data, because if it's not good data, then it doesn't mean anything at all. But at the same time, when you're deploying a manual based system, and manual based systems have risks involved when it comes to double handling data. And when you're double handling data and you're taking it from a spreadsheet or you're taking it from a checklist and you're putting it into an Excel spreadsheet, well, there's going to be some issues there. The timely input of the data, is the data read correctly? So having a system with the point of use to input that information to ensure that it's a timely input, so it makes sense, and also it's an accurate input. And that's sort of what we're really trying to do here with the automation of compliance standards with Isolocity.
I love it. That I really appreciate it, Chris. I think your software is fantastic, and I definitely recommend folks to take a look at Isolocity and understand the value of everything we talked about today, from standards, using standards, leveraging that, using that to inform your data and your acceptable tolerances and ranges, and having a solution that can allow you to capture the data accurately, timely, as you described, and trend it, and then use it to make informed decisions at the end of the day. And I know we've covered so much here. I want to see what other questions folks have, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to answer any questions for Chris, for me, for Darwin. I see. Let me start with the first one here. Can Isolocity work for all types of cannabis companies? How does it accommodate different setups? So I don't know if you can speak to that at all, Chris.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we first launched Isolocity, the idea was to build a framework that allowed our clients to adjust, create, manipulate, augment the workflows to meet their unique setup. And that really positioned us well to work with cultivators, extractors, people who create edibles, pre-rolls, laboratory people who do analytical testing, for example. So Isolocity is a very user-driven, customizable platform, and that allows it to be adopted to and augmented to really meet any sort of environment in the cannabis industry. And we've proven that across the board. We work with all types of different companies across the world.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And I wasn't sure if there was a question there, Jason, but it looks like you made an important point there, just to reinforce it. The manual systems are prone to error. Who owns the updates? How often are they reviewed to ensure SOPs comply with requirements? This is a great system for automating the process. So kudos to you, Chris, and the Isolocity team. And from what I know of Jason, that is a process improvement Lean Six Sigma guy. So that is all, he gets it, right? Cost of quality and everything we've talked about here.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate those kind words.
Any other final questions? Otherwise, I'll give give Darwin or Chris any final mentions, but I do want to kind of let everybody know, as you mentioned, I think a good amount of us here, Chris included, Darwin and I, as you mentioned, booth 508. So remember, booth 508 for folks that are coming to MJ BizCon. ASU International will be having a fantastic booth. Darwin and I will be holding down that fort as much as we can. Chris, I know you're going to be around. Look forward to seeing you there. Folks can get in touch with Isolocity. I'll make sure that email, Emmy, if you don't mind putting that email in the chat as well for folks that want to follow up with Isolocity. There's some really great things happening here in the industry, and the final thing I'll just give folks a sneak preview on before I give Darwin the floor for last thoughts is RSVP for next month, which Emmy put in the chat, November 30th. I'm really excited. Andrew Klein, who's the former policy director of NCIA's, policy director for NCIA. He's going to be joining us, as well as another colleague. We're going to be talking about federal legalization, lab shopping, industry standards. Oh wait, have we already talked about that? There's just so much more to cover on industry standards, right? Really dialing into the lab shopping issue and more. So that's going to be a really eye-opening webinar. So I hope you guys can all join us for that. Be sure to RSVP while you're here today, and then come join, like I said, me, Darwin, Chris, Adrian's going to be there. Others will be there. Come join us at MJ Biz next month if you're going to be around. I'm going to shut up for a second and give Darwin a moment here.
Great. Yeah, David, I just wanted to say thank you again so much. I had an absolute pleasure hanging out with you, talking about when things go wrong. Shout out to the GMP Collective for running things, and I apologize. I had our sponsor here just a second ago, Isolocity, right?
Isolocity.
Isolocity. There we go.
It's philosophy.
I apologize. Thanks, Chris, for hosting. Yeah, I just wanted to say if you guys wanted to follow me, I'm on LinkedIn under Darwin Millard, or you can Instagram the Spock of Cannabis. And with that, I just wanted to say, live long and process.
Ciao. Bye, everyone.
Love
Thanks,
it,
David.
everybody.
Thanks,
Have a
Darwin.
great day, all. Thanks for joining. We'll see you soon.